lot of these things in more depth. But on that point, actually, let me ask you, and I will acknowledge at the outset that this is an awkward question. I was a Rhodes Scholar, too. I went up in 1995. You went up a decade later. So I was the first openly gay American Rhodes Scholar. And I got there, and I had come out in college. So I applied for the Rhodes Scholarship as an openly gay person. It definitely came up in the selection process, and then I got there, and I learned that I was the first American who'd ever been out.
Wow.
But that was a decade before you. And you went through college, and then the Rhodes Scholarship process, and getting the Rhodes Scholarship, and going to work for McKinsey, and joining the Navy, and deploying to Afghanistan, and coming home, and running for mayor in your hometown, and getting elected before you came out at the age of 33.
Yeah.
And I bring this up, and I acknowledge it's a difficult question, not because it's bad that you didn't come out to your 33, but I think it would have killed me to be closeted for that long. I just think about what it takes as a human being to know something and to have to bifurcate your public life. And for you to have had all of those difficult transitions and experiences and to be aiming as high as you were all of that time and not coming out until your early 30s, I just wonder if that was hurtful to you, if it hurt you to do it.
It was hard. It was really hard.
Coming out is hard, but being in the closet is harder.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean. I mean, it was and it wasn't. First of all, it took me plenty of time to come out to myself. So I did not, the way you did or the way my husband did, figure out at such an early age that I probably should have. I mean, there's certainly plenty of indications by the time I was 15 or so that I could point back and be like, yeah, this kid's gay. But I guess I just really needed to not be. And, you know, there's this war that breaks out, I think, inside a lot of people. When they realize that they might be something they're afraid of. And it took me a very long time to resolve that. I did make sure, as a kind of final way of coming out to myself, to come out to at least a couple of people in my life before I took office, because I knew that I didn't want to have that kind of psychological pressure of at least not being out to somebody.
But you sort of swore them to secrecy, or you?
They understood, yeah, that this was a very sensitive thing. They also pointed out, as your friends do, you know, patting you on the back, that I hadn't really made it easy on myself, because at that point, professionally, I had two things in my life that really mattered to me professionally. One of them was being an officer in the military, in the reserve, and the other was being an elected official in Indiana. Neither of which is exactly LGBT friendly. In fact, both of which I assumed were totally incompatible with being out. And both of which were very meaningful. One of the risks that I think people with meaningful jobs have, especially people in politics actually, is because your job is meaningful, a lot of the meaning in your life comes from your job, which is a real problem, because part of what is needed, I think, to be good at your job in politics is to have something worth more to you than winning. You know, you have to be ready to walk away from that job in order to deserve it. But I did get a lot of meaning from that work. And in some ways, because it was so demanding, I almost didn't mind for an inordinately long time that I didn't have much of a personal life.
Yeah.
And I did not have a dating life while I was closeted or anything like that. The city was a jealous bride for a long time and kept me busy, but it was really the deployment that put me over the top. I realized that you only get to be one person. You don't know how long you have on this earth. And by the time I came back, I realized, like, I gotta do something.
Were you sure at the time when you came out that it would cost you re-election?
I was pretty sure it was going to be a big complication, but I had no idea. I mean, I felt like things were going well in the city. I felt like I'd done a good job by the people of South Bend, and I had some level of trust that I would be rewarded for that with a re-election. But there's no way to really know. There was no playbook. I mean, no executive in Indiana had ever been out, and so it was kind of a leap of faith. And I just, you know, I wrote it all down, put it in an op-ed. Dropped it in the South Bend Tribune and woke up that day and saw what would happen.
And then got reelected with 80% of the vote.
And then there you go.
Yeah.
So you treat people, you trust people, and at least in this case, they reciprocated that trust. And, you know, that was more than I got elected in the first place. And so I guess it's one thing that gives me a lot of encouragement. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's plenty, as you know, there's plenty of ugliness that comes in from all over the place. But most people, I think, are either supportive or even enthusiastic about the idea of the first out person going this far, or they find a way to let me know they don't care. And that's historic too. I mean, one day the way this will work is if a mayor's trying to figure out how to come out, you go to the next rubber chicken dinner you're going to and your date's the same sex, that's that, right? People shrug, figure it out, and get on with the evening. It didn't feel that way in Indiana in 2015, but one of the things that I think I can do before the first vote is cast, is maybe make it a little easier just by being here.
Right.
For the next person who comes along.
Yeah, you've written the history in some ways about how to do it, and then the next person gets to live it. I have a couple more questions for you. Will you stay? Last word with Lawrence O'Donnell. Good evening, Lawrence.
Good evening, Rachel. And that really was an extraordinary interview. I want to get your reaction to the discussion you started, which is a discussion I believe we have never seen before in presidential campaign history, about the challenge of coming out, and what was your reaction to Pete Buttigieg's explanation to you about why it was so much slower a process for him than it was for you?
It's weird because he's sitting right here, but I'll tell you that as if, I'll give you my response as if that's not true. You know, I think that there is a conversation that happens among gay people that is different than a conversation that happens among straight people when it comes to people coming out. And it's not about homophobia. It's that gay people, for straight people, gay people have nothing interesting going on in terms of their sexual orientation until they come out. And then the act of coming out is a notable thing. And if you're, you know, if you're pro-gay rights and you're supportive of your gay brothers and sisters, then that's seen as a positive thing. And that's the first time you think about it. Among gay people, what we live before we come out is a time of being closeted. And being closeted is an active thing. It's not an absence of something else that straight people can't notice. And I don't exactly know. I'm sure there's ways in which I'm being very politically incorrect by bringing this up, particularly with a presidential candidate. But for somebody who has put his marriage at the center of his campaign and talked so much about what that means in terms of his hope for the country and evolving values, I do think it's interesting to try to define what's otherwise seen as negative space. I mean, for me, coming out was an inability to live as a closeted person. He lived as a closeted person for a longer period of time. Everybody's path to getting there is different. But I wanted to talk to him about how he got there. So I don't know if that was the wrong thing to ask, but it was sort of my burning question about that element of his campaign.
Well, I think that's what you have to ask. You know, it's so interesting because we do these, you and I do this very differently, because all I care about is policy, presidential policy. When you're in the Oval Office, what will you sign? What will you veto? And you find out in your interviews much more about the person than I do. And I'm actually relying on you to do that. And it's kind of why I'm working in another space. It's one of the reasons I work in another space with them. And I think the fact that you were trying to get inside what that experience is, what that formative experience is, it lives in a long tradition of candidate interviews in which, in a variety of ways, people are trying to get inside the experience of that person and what it was like growing up in a certain way, or what it was like in military service and combat. And that issue, that what is inside this person, is something that presidential campaign interviewers have been pursuing for decades.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't put your money on me as like the humaniteer here. I was like the person who's like great with the personal questions. It's not usually my thing. But I mean, I do feel like if you're going to go the distance in a presidential campaign, if you're going to get anywhere near the nomination, you are going to be, and you ought to be, subject to multiple full-body MRIs. And that includes your soul, and that includes your evolution, and that includes the places in which you've faced dark times and made hard decisions and come out the other side of it with a story to tell. And so some of that is policy, and some of that is values, and some of that is how you've chosen to live. And so, I mean, I think with all of these guys, particularly because there's going to be 500,000 of them running in the Democratic campaign, we're all going to have to figure out how to ask all of them everything all the time.
Okay, so quick final question for you. I don't know if it's quick, but was it difficult for you to decide whether to ask that question?
Yes. In part because I felt like I had to like preface it with like, here's the thing about me, which is which I am allergic to. So that made it hard to ask. But I also learned a bunch about him, so I think it was worth it.
Rachel, it really was worth it. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you, Rachel.